thank you for joining us in this conversation that we hope to bring some light to this very emotional issue of evolution from specifically from your perspective, as well as I see several connections between your way of thinking and what Islamic tradition has to say on the vertical dimension of the causes, vertical causality, as you have written a whole book on that. So just to map this conversation, we find, at least I find it very problematic that the Muslim intellectual tradition, the contemporary Muslim intellectual tradition, is following in the footsteps of the Christian tradition in terms of evolution. So when the idea of evolution started in the 19th century, there was a great deal of resistance in certain quarters, and then they invented what you have called the theistic heresy of acceptance. The hardcore evolutionists, they call smuggling God from the back door into the evolution, which is true. I really agree with that. It is. So the Muslims are doing the same now. So it is important to have this conversation with you from that perspective as well. But to begin with, I know that there is the historical background to the emergence of evolution, of Darwinism, is connected with what was happening in the Western civilization in the 19th century.
Dr. Iqbal, one word I didn't catch, the something tradition.
Yes, I was saying that Muslims have recently started to follow what happened in the Christian tradition in terms of acceptance of evolution.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So they, just as in Christianity, we saw the emergence of theistic, so-called theistic evolution.
Yes.
Now we have Muslims who are doing the same, importing the hand of God into the scheme of evolution from the back door. Accepting everything that evolution tells us, but saying, oh, this is all because that's how God has willed it. And you have written quite a bit about this theistic evolution.
Yeah.
And the last thing I was saying is that the emergence of this whole concept of evolution in the Western civilization, as you have said in several of your writings, has an internal dynamics to it. The time was right. There was a connection between the emergence of atheism, emergence of modernism, the emergence of what you call scientism in the Western civilization. And of course, now we are living in a world where everything is seen from the Western perspective, unfortunately, even in the Muslim world.
I'm very sorry to hear that, Dr. Iqbal, because my impression, based upon things that I have read many years ago, my impression was that the Islamic world has managed to avoid these heresies, which have really been devastating in the Christian sphere. And now, if I understand you rightly, there's a trend in the Muslim world itself to move in the same direction.
That's right. It's very sad, but this is the reality we are facing. And Muslim world is a wide spectrum. But I have traveled extensively over the last 20 years in every part of the Muslim world. And I feel so dismayed because 20 years ago, when the educational system started to change, they brought in Western education system at the school level. Now, if you look at the Middle Eastern educational system, it has reached the university level. So the whole generation of young Muslims have emerged, raised in the Western worldview from ground up, from KG.
Oh, yeah, I see.
Yes. So the transformation is so devastating now that, you know, in Arabic we have this axiom is called Jahal Murakkab, which is compound ignorance.
Yeah.
Compound ignorance, like the person who is ignorant doesn't even know that I am ignorant. So we have a whole generation of Muslims now. They are advocating evolution using all kinds of tricks because it's very clear from the Quranic perspective, Quranic worldview, that we cannot have horizontal causation for the existence of the cosmos, existence of life. There has to be vertical causation.
Absolutely.
And that connection is just disappearing so rapidly for two reasons. Number one, Ibn Khaldun in the 14th century, 15th century, he said that all conquered civilizations start to imitate the conqueror because psychologically they feel that, oh, we have been conquered, so the conqueror must be superior. That's why we have been conquered. And this is so. So there is that is one reason. The second reason is really what I would like to focus and hear you out about. That is this rise of science as the deciding factor, not only in matters related to science, but also every other field, that is the scientism.
Scientism, yeah.
Scientism is the disease that has spread everywhere now.
Yes. It's a very powerful influence on the average man because when you look at these technological miracles, for example, our conversing
right. Yes.
in another part of the world, for the common man, this is a very persuasive argument that the scientist is almost all-knowing. He's just way up there, and it's difficult to combat this force.
Yes,
but absolutely necessary.
How do we do it? These are very low level, really very low level, low grade developments in human civilization to be able to have this understanding that you can use these sound waves and you can use these technologies to connect. This is not really. But you're right. For the common person, this is the defining factor. How do we break it?
Well, I think there's no quick and easy way. I mean, it's not something we'll do instantaneously. But, well, for one thing, of course, I think it is essential if, in order to break this, to keep the religious life on a sufficiently high level. In other words, we need the help of God, and so we need to make use of whatever religious foundation exists in order to use its help in destroying these illusions. And then the next thing is we need an appropriate literature. And I have been involved in this project for a long time. I've written many, many books, and in a sense, each of these books deals with some aspect of this problem. And so I think books of that kind are necessary, and it is necessary also to have an outreach on the secondary level. You might say that the books, the kind of books I'm referring to here, are for intellectuals, and that is necessary. It's a sine qua non. The intellectuals need to be set straight.
Yes.
And in our age, the intellectuals worldwide are serving the reverse purpose of what God meant them to do.
Right.
God meant them to enlighten people, and they're confusing people and causing people to look in the wrong direction. So we need food for the intellectuals to, and that is relatively simple. The books exist. It is just necessary to disseminate them, to see to it that considerable segments of the intellectual class have the right ideas. And that's comparatively easy, because actually, from a theoretical point of view, evolution is absolutely impossible. I mean, this is almost a mathematical theorem. As a matter of fact, Dr. Iqbal, it is a mathematical theorem. You have no doubt become acquainted with the work of an American mathematician named William Dembski.
Yeah, I'm actually in contact with him since 2000, and I wrote
that.
Yes, and I had a conversation with him 2 weeks ago on the same topic.
Really?
Yes, yes. He's a good friend, yes.
In 1998, he proved the theorem about, which is very basic. In my language, what he proved is that horizontal causation cannot produce what he calls complex specified information.
Exactly, right.
And since even the simplest living organism contains an immense amount of complex specified information, therefore, horizontal causation cannot produce any form of life. And this is a rigorous mathematical disproof of organic evolution.
Right.
And as you know, Dr. Iqbal, there has been tremendous pushback on this.
Yes.
Practically all the universities have opposed it savagely, and it is a satanic phenomenon.
Yes.
And Satan is very much involved in this, because this is, as a friend of mine used to say, this is for all the marbles.
Yes.
It's total warfare.
Right.
And incidentally, I would like to point out something which is not well known, but should be well known, namely in the Christian sphere, and therefore indirectly worldwide, the main driving force of this theistic evolution was, of course, the Jesuit paleontologist Teilhard de Chardin.
Right.
And when I was writing my book about him, I read everything possible connected with him. And I came across a very early paper that he wrote. It was in his 20s when he wrote it. And it relates an incident in his early life. And basically what he relates in that paper is that one day he was walking in a remote part of the French countryside when, quote, the thing swooped upon me. And so he records that he asked the thing, "Who are you?" And here's the answer that he got. The thing said, quote, "I am the quintessence of all good and all evil." and I am now settled upon you in life and in death.
Really?
These are the words.
Right.
And I'm no exorcist, but I think this is clearly a clear indication that this man was possessed.
Right.
I had a good friend, Father Malachi Martin, who was one of the great exorcists. And I'm sorry I neglected to ask him, but I have no doubt he would say yes. So this is also the explanation why Teilhard de Chardin had such power.
Right.
And because actually, from a normal, rational point of view, what he was writing about is nonsense. I mean, for example, he spoke of the universe as converging to point omega.
Right.
Now, the fact is that, according to modern physics, the very opposite is true. Everything is flying apart at a speed of about 300,000 kilometers per second.
Yes.
And so Teilhard de Chardin talks about convergence to point of omega, just a fantasy, which makes no sense either from the standpoint of physics, much less from the standpoint of theology. So it's really a phenomenon of satanic possession. And I think this also explains why the impact upon the Catholic religion was disastrous. There came the Second Vatican Council, and the younger representatives, they were all Teilhardians. I think there was not a single exception. And they completely ran over the old gods,
right,
and established what could be called a new religion.
Yes.
A counter-religion. Incidentally, Dr. Iqbal, while we are exchanging ideas, let me just mention that in one of my latest books, I have a chapter connecting the ideas of Teilhard de Chardin with what used to be called Gnosticism. Now, as you know, I don't know if there's any Gnosticism in the Islamic world, but in the Christian world, Gnosticism was always the counter-religion to Christianity. And one of the central dogma, if you will, of the Gnostic gurus was the idea of a higher world that you could somehow fly into. And in this chapter that I'm referring to, I point out that with the introduction of the modern world, there is no more higher world to fly into. And so what did the Gnostic gurus do?
Right.
They replaced the idea of going into a higher world with the idea of a future world. And this is where Teilhard de Chardin and this modernism comes in, because that's exactly what stands at issue here.
Right, right.
So the bottom line is that Teilhard de Chardin was not only possessed, but he was the prophet of neo-Gnosticism.
Right.
And the central dogma of neo-Gnosticism is evolution.
Yes. Yes.
And this is what replaces God. Instead of God being the creator, the universe creates itself, and we create ourselves. And according to Teilhard de Chardin, we eventually become God through evolution.
Yes.
So this is the neo-Gnostic form of a satanic counter-religion. And that is why it is so strong, because Teilhard de Chardin is not just an individual, he's the mouthpiece of the quintessential evil force in the universe, the force counter which opposes God. So it is no wonder that this movement has been incredibly powerful. It has taken over almost all of our higher education, and it's even going into in our country, it's going into the grade school.
Yes.
Little children are being taught things which are purely satanic.
Exactly, exactly.
So the situation is very, very grave.
Very grave, and the tragedy is there is a proverb in Urdu. They say that in the feet of the elephant, everybody's foot is in the feet of the elephant. Everybody's foot is in so wherever the elephant is going, the whole world is going with that elephant. And this modern Western civilization is the elephant that is now everywhere. Like it has just tied every other civilization to itself. We have a hadith, we have a saying of our prophet. He said that these are the prophecies that he made before he died, that you will follow the footsteps of the Jews and the Christians. If they went into a lizard hole, you will go into the lizard hole. He was
I think it is impossible to convey the high truths based upon religion to people who are indoctrinated in the modern ideology and believe all that. It is impossible to explain to these people the higher truths. I think the starting point must be to prove to them the absolute nonsense of what they believe, because that's on their level. Here we do not.
Yes.
And I think that is possible.
Right.
That is possible. And I think to a small degree, but insufficient degree, I have done that in my writings. I have argued here and there that the modern Weltanschauung is not based upon any scientific principles, and B, that it is really nonsense, absolute nonsense. And so I think this approach should be picked up by as many qualified people as possible. It is a kind of reductio ad absurdum.
Right.
For example, in one of my most recent writings, I just pointed out and explained the fact that there is really no such thing as a scientific Weltanschauung, because if these mathematical physicists were right in what they say, the world would be such that it cannot be looked upon at all. So as soon as you express a Weltanschauung, a worldview,
right,
you are in a sense denying what the scientist has to say, because nobody has seen quantum particles, much less aggregates of them.
Yes, yes.
So there is a way of rationally disproving the contemporary outlook. In fact, the more one looks into this, the more amazed one is how really incongruous it is. It reminds me of that famous saying, the emperor has no clothes.
Yes.
Because if you look upon the modern, quote, scientific Weltanschauung, it really is nonsense. And it doesn't take a PhD in anything to recognize that.
So when you mention, for instance, Einstein's suppositions, I think in one of your pieces you have mentioned that this idea that Einstein had about there being no resting place K0 not existing, that in itself is not provable.
I'm glad, Dr. Iqbal, that you touch upon the Einstein phenomenon, because it is really a very, very fascinating subject. First of all, let me say that if you take the trouble, if you take the trouble to look into the predictions of Einsteinian physics,
Right.
And the actual empirical findings, you realize that there is not a single Einsteinian prediction that really squares this experiment. With one exception, and I point this out again and again, the famous formula E equals mc squared is, of course, true and immensely powerful, of course. The point is, however, that this formula has nothing to do with Einsteinian relativity. And I think even few physicists know that. The reason I can say that is because the formula was known in the 19th century.
Really?
And it occurs in the classical journal literature before Einstein, velocity that we are dealing with, and c is the speed of light.
Right.
If one remembers how enormous the speed of light is, what this means is that it is almost impossible to find an empirical situation where Einsteinian physics differs measurably from the classical. And in this connection, I found that there is one such area nowadays, namely GPS, the global positioning system, which involves dimensions where Einsteinian effects become measurable. They're very, very small, but definitely measurable. And I was very, very amazed when pursuing this matter. I found out that GPS people don't use relativity theory because planes would crash. But the political situation is such that they don't admit that. In other words, to the outside world, they use terminology which makes you believe that they use relativistic formulas, when in fact they don't. So it's a very interesting, if I were young, I would want to study the Einstein phenomenon to see what's behind it.
Yes, I was just going to ask that, because I used to be fascinated by the summer of 1905. Einstein used to fascinate me this is 20 years ago. This young man, 1905, he publishes 5 papers, one after the other, which in retrospect we say demolished the entire classical physics and started a new chapter in our understanding of the cosmos, the forces, relativity of time and space, and all of those things. How do you see he became almost like a symbol of the modern age? He became the symbol. Every child you say Einstein's name and the head goes down. Like, what is it?
You're absolutely right. There is something very, very special going on here. I don't pretend to know that, but let me put it this way. There is something behind Einstein. And Einstein, the man I like very much. He was simple, he was unassuming, right, and very odd, and but a good man and a brilliant physicist. You just mentioned the year 1905. There was a record, a Brownian motion and the photoelectric effect, and then on top of it all, relativity theory.
Yes.
But I will not have the chance to go into this issue because it would require years and years of study. There's something behind that.
Right.
And he's, in other words, Einstein is not alone. He's the mouthpiece of something. And I think the bottom line, we can all guess. We can all guess of who stands ultimately behind the whole thing, because Einsteinian physics has been a great boon to the neo-Gnosticism. I mean, for example, the evolutionist, from his general theory of relativity, evolutionism is practically a mathematical corollary.
Yes, yes.
Incidentally, as I'm sure you know, this Einsteinian astrophysics, which is evolutionist in its very mathematical structure, has been definitively disproved empirically based upon the empirical results of the Planck 2009 satellite. This so-called axis, which lies in the plane of the ecliptic, that would be absolutely impossible on an Einsteinian basis. So there's really, relativistic astrophysics has been disproved. Of course, the world does not acknowledge it. They just stop talking about that.
Yes, yes. Do you see any connection between this rise of evolutionary outlook and Einstein's work, or what came out of that particular worldview? Where is the connection between these two apparently distinct developments in the Western civilization? Of course, we are looking at these two to be product of a civilization. It's not individuals. There is a whole civilizational current behind this, because science ultimately is the activity of a civilization. In the Islamic civilization, science, which by the way was the longest living scientific tradition, the enterprise of science in the Islamic civilization lasted 800 years. There is no other scientific enterprise that has this history. But when the modern Western civilization took in the 17th century, when this modern science took off from whatever forces were working, where do you see the convergence, if there is any, between the evolutionary post-Darwinian outlook and Einstein's worldview?
Well, I think that so far as foundations go, it all points in the same direction. There are many ways of formulating it. One would be to say there are no absolutes.
Right.
And that is to say the same thing as that there is no God.
Yes.
So I see everything in fundamentally a theological optic. There are two realities, the great reality and then the counter reality. And this intellectual history that we are talking about exemplifies that great struggle. And people, for the most part, are pawns in this game.
Right.
I don't think that Einstein, the man, really originated anything. He was brilliant, a mathematical physicist of unique stature, and he was used.
Yes, okay.
He doesn't know that. He was used.
Right. It's very similar to the political sphere, where the puppets on the stage, they keep changing the names and faces, but the forces behind them remain the same.
Yes.
Yes, very
when one turns on the news, one has the feeling where have I heard this before?
Right, right.
Incidentally, one thing I would like to point out, because it's not generally known, excuse me, it's not generally known, and I think it is of great interest. Namely, as perhaps you know, I have all my life been a Platonist. And incidentally, also in my young years, I was very much interested in the Vedic tradition, and I traveled there and to see what I could see. And I realized, first of all, now that the Platonist and the Vedic tradition are one and the same. There are a few little differences, but fundamentally it is the same. And incidentally, in this connection, I was very interested. There is a British Platonist of the 18th century, Thomas Taylor, whose writings are incredible. I don't know where he got this knowledge, but he demonstrates that Platonism is also yogic in almost the same sense as the Vedic tradition. He writes in detail about Pythagoras traveling to Egypt, and then he became a disciple of an Egyptian master. And Thomas Taylor describes the daily life of these Egyptian people, and when I read this description of how these people, including the young Pythagoras, how they lived, I said to myself, by God, this is what I saw in India. It's exactly the same thing. The one point of difference, and it's significant, is that the Platonists and Pythagoreans, they were profoundly interested in geometry, not as we are interested in mathematics nowadays, but they recognize that geometry exists on the intermediary plane, on the psychic plane, but its truth comes from the aeviternal plane. And therefore, there is, in principle, a way of using geometry to ascend. This ascent from the psychic to the aeviternal plane, this is a great challenge of yogic religion. And in the Pythagorean and Platonist schools, they used geometry as a technical means.
Yes.
And I found this very, very interesting. And incidentally, this is the one difference I see between the Platonist and the Vedic tradition. The cosmology is one and the same. But so far as methodology is concerned, what distinguishes the Pythagorean and Platonist is the fact that they use geometry as the means par excellence of making that ascent. And there's nothing like that in the Vedic tradition.
Right.
But let me point out something that connects very much to our earlier conversation. Namely, both the Platonist and the Vedic tradition envisage a tripartite cosmos, which is, so to speak, the cosmic analog of the tripartition of man into corpus, anima, spiritus. So there's a corresponding partition of the macrocosm. And what I have pointed out in my writings, which is not explicitly given in the Platonist or Vedic writings, is this. I have pointed out that the aeviternal stratum is not subject either to space or time. The psychic is subject to time, but not to space. And then the corporeal is subject, of course, to both space and time.
Right.
And I was amazed to see that the mere fact that there exists this intermediary plane, a time-only world, this in itself disproves all of relativistic physics. It is gone.
Right.
And incidentally, we ordinary humans, we do enter the intermediary plane in the dream state.
Right, right.
And when we see a dream castle, its spatial content is mere appearance, because there is no space in the intermediary plane, but its temporal bound is real. So this, I was amazed the first time I came to India, the second day, in fact, I had an encounter with a fakir who gave me evidence that he could do two things. He could enter the intermediary plane and get things out, and he could also put things in. And I was so amazed to see in India that a fakir who earns his livelihood getting a few dollars from passerbys knows about cosmic mysteries that no one in our Institute for Advanced Study has any idea about.
Right, right.
So the very existence of the intermediary plane rigorously disproves all of relativistic physics.
Right, right.
So this fakir in New Delhi disproved Einstein.
Yes.
Rigorously.
Yes, yes. In terms of the foundational, there are two aspects of evolution I would like to talk about. One is the definition of species, which I find very fascinating because they remain vague about foundational definitions in their own system. Like you ask anybody, Richard Dawkins or anybody, they will come up with 30 different definitions of species. And then the whole thing is based on origin of species, like one species turning into you ask them, what is the definition of species? And they give you 30 different definitions.
That's very interesting.
So even at that level, foundational level, there is this huge confusion. And the second aspect, especially this modern Muslim evolutionists, because the Quran mentions very specifically the creation of the first human being, Adam. The first human being is made from clay, and breath is infused, ruh, the spirit, is added to the clay. Like these, there are graphic descriptions. So they say, well, human race is a separate species. We can say that human beings were created in complete form, as we know, but everything else evolved. So they make this distinction between the human species and the other species. There are two strands of the current discourse. One, some Muslims say no, they accept everything that evolutionism talks about, but they just said this is how God willed it. So these random cells, amino acids combining together, starting the life, and then life propagating on its own, emerging, evolving until we get the human beings. The others say, no, human beings came from outside the earthly domain. And I find both of them are nonsense, but I would like to hear your...
Well, I think it is absolutely incontrovertible that from a traditional metaphysical point of vantage, man is something categorically different from the animals. Exactly what that is, I don't feel competent to speculate about, but he is the only creature, quote, made in the image and likeness of God.
Right.
And I think it takes a truly wise man to understand this correctly. I think this is way up there, this truth. And there is utter confusion about all these basic issues in today's scientific world. The great paradox is that whereas we live in an age where we are in a position to execute technological miracles, the world has never been as ignorant as it is now.
Yes, very true. Very true. Yes. 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 In terms of the worldview that says, if you believe in the creation, like there is this binary that either there is evolution or there is creation, and the whole narrative that came out of so-called Christian creationism, tied to the 6 days of creation, young earth, and the rest of it, is something that is put against this evolutionary narrative, as if these are the only two possibilities left for life to evolve, life to have emerged on this planet. And they say, look, this 6-day creation doesn't make sense, or we need so many millions of years for Earth to cool, etc., etc. So how would you respond to this binary that has been set up, as if there is no other possibility?
I think in the, at least in the Western world, it is absolutely necessary at one point to distinguish between an exoteric and an esoteric level. I don't think this is equally true, say, in the Platonist or the Vedic world, where religion is structured entirely in a different way. But in the Western world, it is absolutely necessary to distinguish between these two levels. And I think one of the reasons that Christianity is not doing well in this period, and there's a great deal of falling off, the great deal of heresy, confusion, and even evil. And this has a lot to do with the fact that in the Christian tradition, esotericism has eventually been outlawed.
Right.
In the patristic age, you had great sages like St. Augustine, for example. So he was a bishop. That means he could speak to simple, ordinary people and give them religious truths. But he also was an esoterist of the highest order, and the two coexisted harmoniously. Right. It was a perfect harmony. In his Confessions, for example, which is readable by everyone. It's a delightful book. It relates how from a sinner he became a saint. Right. Fascinating story. But in that very book, you will read passages that are quintessentially esoteric. And I'll just quote one of them to show you what I mean. One of the chapters of his Confessions begins with the following words. He's speaking to God, and he says, I see these others beneath thee, an existence they have because they are from thee. yet no existence, because they are not what thou art. I love that statement.
Yes.
I feel that in a way, the highest metaphysics is somehow concealed in that.
Right.
And everything was very, very harmonious in the patristic era. And then at the beginning of the 11th century, trouble began. And this, in fact, led to the division between the Roman and the Orthodox churches, which is very regrettable. It's like cutting a living body in half.
Right.
It is good for neither side.
Yes.
And there was a lot of power concentrated in one man, which is always dangerous.
Yes.
And the upshot of the matter is that by the time the, say, 19th century came, esotericism no longer existed in the West. And the one point on which I agree with Frithjof Schuon, I disagree with him on many points, but
right.
where I fully agree is that a religion in the long run cannot survive without an esotericism.
That's right. That's right. Yes.
That is absolutely true. And so we find now that Christianity is in a transitional phase. I'm no prophet, I don't know what will happen, but I do know that in the end it'll come out all right.
It will come out all right.
Yes. Says so.
Yes.
Not
yes.
because of our doing.
Right. Right.
But esotericism, I think, is a very major point to bear in mind
right.
when we think about these kinds of problems, because, as I said, religion cannot survive without an esotericism. Do you see this also as true in Islam? What is the...
Yeah, very much so, because in the difference I see, I've lived for 40 years in the Western environment. The difference I see still being there, that in Islam, the esotericism is built into the very day of a believer, in the sense that in the very day, in the very living, our day begins at dawn. Our day begins with the sun. Our day comes to an end with the sunset. Between the emergence of the sun and its setting, there are 5 daily prayers which every believer prays, consciously or unconsciously, leaving the exoteric realm, entering into the presence of the divine, washing our bodies like literally cleaning ourselves 5 times a day to enter that space, which I find, in the Western, in the contemporary Christianity, very few people actually practice. So the experiential reality of having that esoteric experience as part of your daily life, as part of, you open the book, you open the Quran, and every believer, every Muslim knows that this is the speech of God. You come into contact with a word, in a language that pulsates with esoteric presence of something from far beyond. I read one word literally, I stop. You come to a word and you have been reading this for 40 years in your life, and suddenly this word has a new meaning today. Yesterday I was talking to a friend, he said, he just used the word Shakila. We are talking about what is the human paradox here? Do we have freedom? Do we have free will? If everything is, we are talking about how we are conceived in the womb of the mother. We carry a genetic code. We also carry a spiritual makeup of some kind. And our Prophet told us that every child is born upon fitra, on primordial nature, imprinted by the presence of God. Every child coming into this world comes into this world with this innate, built-in receptivity to the presence of God. And then parents and the influences start to diminish that polished mirror. And this is where Schuon is also very relevant, because this, his Transcendence, his book on transcendent, the title I forget, but the transcendence of our religions, transcendent, starts with the transcendent, the title. Anyways, the idea that this presence of the esoteric is part of every true religion, because all true religions come from one God. Like we believe in the same prophets as Christians do. They are also our prophets.
Yeah.
So in the sense, every conscious Muslim, the Muslim who is not just doing the ritual things without any understanding, comes into direct experiential contact with the esoteric many times a day. That, to me, seems to be the last hope of surviving this onslaught of materialism and exotericism, because even the most secularized Muslim has this experiential reality of at times entering the other world. So of course, the sad reality is that we are seeing the destruction of other civilizations at a speed and at a scale never witnessed in human history. Like you go to the farthest desert in Arabia, and modern technology is there, and they are worshiping modern technology like they worship God. Like this, I'm fascinated with Heisenberg. Heisenberg wrote in 1959 that every tool that is created carries the spirit of its creator with it. Every tool that is created carries the spirit of the maker of that tool with it.
Who said that?
Heisenberg.
Heisenberg
wrote this essay in 1959 or 55, one of those 2 days. I'm fascinating with this insight that the tools being created by modern science and technology, when they arrive in a different civilization, they would cause havoc, he said. They would cause havoc because these tools are carrying the spirit of the Western civilization where they were invented.
Amazing. I would love to read that.
I'll send you that quote. I'm just there. And he was so true, because when these tools arrived, like even now, people don't know how to drive the cars on the roads because these were camel riders a generation ago. Camels had their own rules. Camels knew how to. Now their cities are clogged with these mechanical cars, and they don't know what lanes are. They don't know how to follow rules because it's not in their psyche. This is something imported suddenly, and several generations, like in the West, this is a gradual phenomena. It took centuries, 2-3 centuries, for the modern world to be where it is. And this is an organic process. But what this
important point.
The speed with which destruction has happened, and our Prophet told us that these Arabs are going to compete and vie against each other in the construction of tall buildings. And they are literally doing it. Like in the Gulf, they are saying, they are measuring how many feet our building is higher than your building.
This is very true. The modern world, by its very technological source, has a tremendous impact. I don't know what adjective to use. In a sense, it is spiritual, but in a bad sense.
Yes.
The very use of the internet, for example,
exactly. This
has its great advantages.
Right.
Obviously, we're talking this morning, but there's a cost, there's a price.
Huge, huge.
And I think it has a big impact on not only the psychological, but the spiritual life.
Definitely, definitely.
And I think, when I think, for example, of my early experience of visiting sadhus in the Himalayan region, everything they used was somehow from the earth.
Yes.
And which means that it had a double meaning. It had a physical and also a spiritual meaning.
Exactly.
And this has been lost. But I must say, when I was traveling in Muslim parts of the world, and I saw these men 5 times a day, wherever they were, spread out the prayer carpet and pray to God, I was deeply impressed. I was very, very deeply impressed. And I began to feel that they seem to be stronger than we are, because they have not yet thrown overboard their spiritual heritage.
Right, right.
And
when was that? When did you travel? How long ago was that?
Oh, very long ago. My first trip to India, and therefore the Eastern world, was in 1960.
Yes.
And then been to India 6 times. And usually on the way to India, I would stop in between, and this gave me glimpses of the Muslim world.
Right.
And I can only say that when I saw these people forget everything,
yes,
and bow down before God, I was deeply impressed.
right.
It happened once when I was in a waiting room at the London airport, and there was an older man, and we were all sitting in this crowded waiting room, and yes, at the appointed hour, he spread out his carpet, and I could see that he is not aware of any of us. We don't matter, we don't exist. Yes. It was just he and his God.
Yes.
And I thought it was very, very beautiful, and I had deep respect.
Right, right, right.
And this we have lost in the West. I mean,
yes,
there may be a few isolated individuals who live that way, but even in our churches, there's no concept anymore of that, this kind of religion.
Yes, yes. How do you keep hope with this force, this evil force is gaining more momentum and more force by the day, with every new invention, with every new, like the way I live here in Canada, but my my spiritual groundings are somewhere else. I don't really, my body lives here. But when I see destruction at a scale that, within this one single lifetime, as if it's been several lifetimes,
yeah,
you feel a sense of, you still hold on to hope, you still believe in God, you still have this inner strength, but the speed with which things are going, there has to be some counter force somewhere.
I, along with so many other people, I would say most people who still adhere to their religion, I believe that we are heading into very difficult times. It's not the end of the world, but what in Christianity is often referred to as a chastisement. Right. We have offended God, yes, in such a huge way that in God's justice, yes, we will have to bear the consequences. I'm confident that he's not yet ready to wipe out the human race, and God willing, in the end of it all, there will be a victory, but we're heading into very difficult times.
Do you see that acceleration as well? acceleration of these difficult times, like even just during the last 2 decades, how the black darkness has been exceedingly conquering more territory, more hearts, more minds, more people. You see that? Yeah.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. You know, it's like a stone rolling down a hill. The
Gaining
further
more.
it goes, the faster it goes.
Yes, yes.
And this is why a point will have to be reached where, as it were, God speaks.
Right, right.
So I fully believe in this idea of the chastisement. I don't think it will be the end of the world, not yet, but it will be the end of a certain segment of civilization. We're not just going to go on and on and on as we have been going for so many centuries. That is impossible.
Right, right.
And I believe that there will be much suffering, that many people will not survive it, but God is in charge.
Yes.
And that's all I can say. Therefore, I'm basically an optimist, but I think the civilization that we are now witnessing and exteriorly at least are part of, that civilization does not have long to go.
Right, right. This Martin Lings has this wonderful title, The 11th Hour, one of his very short books.
Yes.
The 11th Hour. I just love that book. It's
yes.
Yeah.
He was a wonderful man. I corresponded with him a little, and he was a wise man and a very good man.
Yes, very good man. His insights are even more penetrating than Schuon's. That I find it at certain level of contemporary realities and how he experienced the rapid destruction of the higher levels of understanding of higher levels because he was in Egypt. And he used to go to Pakistan every year until the last year of his life. He had a group of followers there, and he would go there and just to be in the presence of his presence was so beautiful. But in the 11th Hour, in that short book, he talks about there's a parable of the vineyard. The owner of the vineyard. He brings in. I think this is. He brings in the laborers to work from morning to dawn, and he promised to give them 1 kirat, and they leave at midday, and then he hires another set, and they work from midday to the second period, and then they leave, and then he hires the third group, and he offers them twice as much as the first two.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, the first group that had toiled so long, they say, "Oh, we toiled all day and you are giving us 1 kirat, and these people came later and you're giving them twice." And the owner says, "Does my money belong to me or does it belong to you? Do I have the right to distribute as I wish? Am I not giving you what I promised to give you?"
Yeah.
That parable, it always fascinates me because it is from the biblical tradition, but there is a saying of the prophet more or less to the same, pointing to the same reality, that those who came later would be rewarded because, and the explanation is because their struggle was more difficult. Like had we lived 1400 years ago?
I never heard that. I was always puzzled by this parable,
right?
And I still feel that there is incomparably more in that parable than I now understand.
I see. Yeah. Because I sometimes, we all of us who have some kind of experiential. We all want to live in the time when the Prophet was actually walking and talking on the streets. We want to be in his presence every single day. I long for that time when I could have been there in his presence, in his personal presence. And this parable is that somehow the spiritual transformation that came along with the presence of the last of the prophets on earth, it created an esoteric reality for those people who believed in him, which made their toiling and their struggle easier than those who came later. So the luminosity of the prophetic light, as always happens, diminishes at a certain level. It decreases day after day after day. Therefore, God in his justice knows that 1400 years later, this slave of mine, this devotee of mine, struggling, has more difficulties. He's dealing with more darkness around him compared to when the prophetic light was there. So in a way, this continuation of the human journey, it's totally opposite to the evolutionary narrative. Because spiritually, we are entering more and more darkness as we move away from the time when the prophets were on this earth.
Yes, yes.
Like those Jesus Christ, like himself, just his presence. Just imagine like the light that came out of him, the light that came of any prophet. That light, that luminosity, the physical, actual presence, as we move further and further away, is harder and harder to access.
Yes, yes.
So
I believe very much that it is very necessary on a worldwide basis to develop a right understanding on the part of religiously oriented people of not only their own religion, of course, but also of other religions.
Right.
Now, obviously, our understanding of other religions is limited by the fact that we are not part of that religion. But at the very least, I think it is imperative that all false ideas should be discarded. If we don't know anything, at the very least, let us not have a false idea.
Right.
And also, I think one needs to avoid both of two extremes. One extreme is what was in olden times so common, to look at other religions as somehow inferior or demonic or what you will. It was an a priori negative feeling towards other religions. This has to go. But the other extreme also has to go. The other extreme of the transcendent unity of religion.
I agree 100% with you. 100%. Yes. This is the book I was referring to. Schuon's. Yes. I disagree. Yes.
And so I wrote a book, as a matter of fact, last year, in which I deal with Vedanta and Christianity, and I argue that they have much in common, but also in their eschaton, there's almost an antipodal opposition. What is it that they have in common? It is the ethics declared by Christ and the ethics that Sri Krishna instructs Arjuna with. They're the same ethic. When Arjuna asks Sri Krishna, what is the highest state of yoga? What is the sign that you have attained perfection in yoga? He says, you have attained perfection in yoga when you regard the pain and pleasure of all creatures as you regard your own. This is true of the Vedas, it is true of Christianity, the identical ethics. But when it comes to the question of eschaton, the Vedic eschaton is unquestionably what I call nirvanic. There's a blowing out of the candle flame, right. And we are that candle flame. We as human beings are. Yes. And this is opposite to the eschaton given to us by Christ, because the eschaton given to us by Christ, even the physical body is said to be resurrected. And this is a mystery which almost everyone sort of says, no, that's too much. Yes. But from a Platonist point of view, it is comprehensible. Yes. So this is a purely esoteric idea. And so in this little book, I conclude that both of these religions are true because they are given by God, but they're not the same religion. They have the same ethic, but their eschaton are antipodal. And I found that basic concepts or terms of the Judeo-Christian tradition are completely absent in the Vedas. Right. The Vedas are much older. Yes. The Vedas were there before Abraham was born. Right. And I was amazed, for example, the idea of Adam and the fall and the expulsion from the Garden of Eden. There's nothing like that in the Vedas. In fact, there's no Sanskrit words even for sin. Right. So I realized that this idea is that all religions are more or less different ways to the same summit. This is a heresy. It is. It is absolutely a heresy, and a dangerous one, because it impedes our understanding of any religion. Yes. Beginning with our own. As long as we think like that, right. We have placed ourselves in a point of vantage where we cannot understand anything religious.
That's very true. That's very true. And that brings us to a point where I hope that at this commonality, this need for all religious people at different levels, intellectual, social, everywhere, to have at least some common strategy, some common platform, some common way of correcting, well, we cannot correct, but at least holding the mirror to where we are going as a race, because the elephant's foot is now dragging everyone to the same pit. So I hope we can continue these conversations and build some kind of platforms at least at intellectual level in one way or the other, and some spiritual level as well. So
I'm very, very happy, Dr. Iqbal, that we had this opportunity to exchange ideas, and God willing, we shall meet again. If ever by chance you happen to be traveling in this near California, and I'm still here, please do come. Inshallah. It would be such a pleasure.
Inshallah, I'll try. I have a nephew in Davis, and inshallah, I used to travel a lot in the United States, but may God bring us together soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Okay,
all the best to you.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.